Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this Diving Incident Report 2020 presentation covering the 2020 Diving Incident Report. My name's Jim Watson. I'm the Safety and Incidents Advisor for BSAC and one of the people who compiled the overall report. So what we're going to cover today is, first of all, some thanks for people. So most importantly, thanks for everyone who contributed reports in one form or another, either as individuals, as members of BSAC. We get reports from the MCA, RNLI, other UK-based agencies, and in the Republic of Ireland, CFT have been contributing significantly to the reports for the last few years, and Inland Sites report, and a whole host of other people. So thanks very much to them for that input. It allows us to pull together all of the information that is included in the report. Thanks to Lizzie Bird for compilation and trawling through the data and input, at least in the early part of this particular incident year. To Ben Peddy for statistical analysis and outputting the data, and Claire Peddy for her continued support in the overall process, and finally Ron Evans for his proofing work on the written comments. What we're going to cover is something of a review of the data, and obviously that's going to include consideration of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure everybody is fed up of hearing about it. Few comments at the end about using the incident report, and finish off with conclusions from 2020 and an opportunity to ask questions. So from the point of view of questions, if you have any questions about the incident report, please use the chat function within the system to put your questions. John's going to collate them, and we'll have some discussion of some of those questions. We can't answer all of them, but we'll do that at the end of this overall session. So in terms of incidents in the year 2020, then just to remind everyone, the incident reporting year that this is drawn from is from January to December in 2020. And in previous reports, we've identified that there was something of a leveling off of the number of reported incidents between 2014 and 2018, leveling around about 300. And then in 2019, there was quite a spike in or an increase in those numbers, which in the 2019 report we attributed to good diving weather and people taking those opportunities. And that leads into this report for 2020, where the numbers have dropped way down and constitute 128 incidents in total entered into the database. 102 of those were UK incidents, which is for sports diver, recreational diving of all affiliations, and that includes what could be considered commercial, where it is recreational diving instruction, but doesn't include offshore or inland at work diving. And it includes 26 overseas reported incidents, which the criteria for limiting those reports is that either there is some BSAC involvement, or for the last couple of years, in recognition of the input from CFT, that it includes all incidents that occur in the island of Ireland, so Eire as well as Northern Ireland being in the UK side of the reports, and they're annotated within the synopsis. And obviously, one of the the clear aspects is the impact of COVID. So, what we've seen over the course of the year, this is distribution of the incidents, and the red bars are uh, an average of incidents reported over the 5-year period from 2015 to 2019, and then the blue is 2020, and you can very clearly there are significant numbers below the normal level, with the exception of December, throughout the year. And so what very rough curve drawn. So for the average, what we see each year is a curve that reflects pretty much the diving season and the amount of diving that's going on. But in 2020, what we had was a fairly normal start to the year and then a very significant drop. And then later in the year, a steady increase, so a similar sort of curve, but with lower numbers, and that very clearly attributable to COVID-19. So looking at the same thing, if we overlay, um, a rough sketch of what was happening with COVID, then in the beginning of the year, from the start of the year through to the 23rd of March, then fairly normal, typical year. And then 23rd of March, everything stopped. And no diving was possible because of all the various restrictions. And what I've shown here is that I've listed the 4 main parts of the UK, but in reality, what we had was 7 different jurisdictions that had different levels of restrictions throughout the year. But broadly, the bulk is covered in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And initially, everywhere locked down in April, and then as essentially, as I've already said, no diving was possible. Now, the astute amongst you may have spotted that there was actually one incident reported in April, in the middle of that very early lockdown. And if you read through the synopsis in the published report, you can make your own judgments on what was happening there. But as the government started to come to terms with what the implications of the pandemic were, then there was a slow and progressive return to diving, which initially in England from the 13th of May, in Northern Ireland and Scotland from June at various points, and later in July in Wales, that there was initial movement that allowed for some limited shore diving, and so there's a steady return to active diving, which in part was delaying what might be considered the normal start to the season. And then as we progressed through the year, limited boat diving was possible, until we got to October and into November, where some initial returns to lockdown or restrictions came in, and then finally at the end of the year, travel restrictions in England in December, and in November and December in Scotland, before the lockdown that effectively hit everybody over the Christmas period. And all of that is the primary explanation, I believe, for the reduction in numbers that we've seen throughout the year. Just briefly looking at the incidents by source. So Coast Guard reports were significantly down, and that's for two reasons. One is fewer incidents occurring, but also that the designated person, the Coast Guard diving liaison officer, moved on to another company, and so it reduced the quality and extent of reporting. So we probably missed a few there. Whereas RNLI reports were still reduced, but not quite to the same extent. So there may be an effect from the level of Coast Guard reporting, and we may have missed some incidents there. Whereas the media sources don't seem to have dropped as much. And certainly the incident in April was widely reported in the media for reasons that will become clear in the synopsis. And to a slight, again, reduction in BSAC reports, or reports using the BSAC form, but probably about 45% of the overall in comparison to the average, but still holding up quite reliable reporting of incidents that did occur. And then looking at incident types, similar distribution. So ascents down by 25%. So quite a big drop there in comparison to some of the other types of incidents. And I think some of that is people taking a more cautious return to the diving, something that we're likely to see more of when it comes to analysing the 2021 report. And I think people taking a sensible, cautious approach. I've highlighted DCI and injury here, which combined are showing at about 55% of in comparison to the combined averages of the two. And the reason I combine them is that sometimes it's quite difficult to differentiate between the ones that should be classified as an injury and those that are clearly DCI. And some of that comes from the limited information that we get from some reports, particularly RNLI, where it's that diver unwell may be reported or something like that. And that quite often is improved by comparison with the information that we get from the Coast Guard, but again, that may have been impacted. So it's worthwhile looking at those two together, but still showing in comparison to the average at 55%. And then the boating and surface related incidents again are at about 50%, and we need to look at that in a little bit more detail. We haven't done so yet, but it just confuses somewhat that in terms of the fact that there was very limited boat diving possible during the course of the year, there's still 50% of boating and surface related incidents, and it probably bears a little bit closer scrutiny. And then finally, fatalities, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a little while, are again understandably down, but reflective of the amount of diving that was taking place. But also, we're always talking about very small but tragic numbers in that respect. So just looking at the reporting from the various agencies, Coast Guards, in terms of overall numbers, very down in terms of numbers, and just point out one incident being reported in May here in the Coast Guard report, and contrast that with the RNLI, where normally we get more reports overall from the Coast Guard and in comparison to the RNLI, and the numbers are down in May there, certainly. Helicopter involvement normally is a fairly close correlation with missing divers and where they're used, and for DCI incidents, and again that that does reflect the amount of level in those particular types of incidents. And then the RNLI, where they reported 6 diving related incidents in May in comparison to the 1 recorded by the Coast Guard. So that gives an indication of perhaps reflecting the impact of the reduced input from the MCA in that particular year. Look briefly at incidents and in relation to maximum depth. So the huge number of unknowns here. Some of that is because of the type of reporting, but we believe that this part, the average trend kind of reflects where the majority of diving is taking place. You see less of an indication of that during 2020, but as Claire said previously, it would be useful to gather some data on where the average diving is taking place, but we haven't got around to doing a formal survey in that as yet. Whereas and the only thing worth commenting on is that as you might expect with the somewhat limited range of boat diving, that there were no incidents recorded where the maximum depth had been greater than 60 metres, whereas the running average is 102. That also may be the case that that particular group of divers are being more cautious, more controlled, whatever. And again, very small numbers, so very difficult to draw any clear conclusions. The depths where the incident occurred, then historically a large proportion occurred at the surface, and that's where DCI symptoms in particular occur after identified after a dive, but also the surface related incidents where missing divers, boat breakdowns, all of that kind of thing fall into that category. Slips, trips, falls, all of that sort of thing. But in relation, there's nothing really astounding here in relation to the 2020 incident report, with the exception perhaps of the increase in the number of unknowns. Again, that's in some part due to the number of incidents reported by the Coast Guard and the RNLI that don't always have the detail of where the incidents actually occurred. So already mentioned the surface and the unknown. So looking at fatalities, then the incident report for 2020 records 6 UK-based fatalities. Of those 6, 2 were BSAC members. 1 involved cave diving, 1 involved snorkeling, and 1 was on the surface before the start of the dive. And we still include and report on all of those because it's still a diving context, and it's still something that we can all learn from. It's it's been questioned before why we include something as extreme as cave diving or potholing, as you might know it, rather than diving in big open caves. But the skills, the techniques are the same, and we think it's relevant to report on those. So looking at the distribution of fatalities, then again, small numbers, and overall on the 5-year rolling average, then what you see is more or less a reflection of what you might term the typical UK diving season. In the 2020 report, 2 of the fatalities occurred before the impact of COVID. And so, but throughout the rest of the year, then clearly less diving going on and fewer tragic accidents where people lost their lives. So, looking at those in a little bit more detail in the normal breakdown. So, each line represents one of the fatalities, and I identified here. Excuse me. This top line is the cave diving incident, and the third one down is the snorkeling. And in common with previous years, then there's a lot of unknowns. Question marks are unknowns. The P is possible based on the information available, and the lack of information is not uncommon. Certainly, 2 of them clearly identified as being unconscious in the water, and 2 of the incidents were from the information that we do have. Then there are some of the characteristics associated or identifiable with the potential for immersion pulmonary edema, and we may get more information on those in the future from coroner's inquests, and so they may be resolved in either not due to IPO or remain possible or be confirmed. But the only other thing about IPO is that in the cave diving and the snorkeling incident, they were both conducted solo, and therefore there was no witness to the sequence of events. That's why there's question marks throughout. And so much more difficult, certainly with the possibility of IPO, you don't have any of those descriptive characteristics. So it's always a possibility, but there is no way of knowing. So if we look further at the incidents, overall, every one of the 6 fatalities had some characteristics of either separation during the course of the dive, or diving in a trio or more, or diving solo. And that's not to say that separation in itself, which is an incident, is more or less is the actual cause of the incident. Neither is trio or more, but obviously we've said many times before that the potential for separation is increased. But when a separation occurs, or you are diving alone, then the chances of surviving are reduced somewhat, and certainly the opportunity for assistance from a buddy is simply not possible. And then looking at a couple of other issues that we've looked at in the past, there was one instance where there was a diver became unconscious under the water. There was a separation, and they were heavy and sank. So either didn't reach the surface or reached the surface and sank again, and weren't able to be recovered until some time later. And one instance of rapid ascent, which included a separation. So looking at the broader types of incident, what we've done through bench statistical analysis over the last 2 or 3 years is look at the types of incidents and look at those incident rates by using the BSAC membership numbers for the year as a proxy for the amount of participation in the sport. And using that to develop these trend lines, which are 5-year rolling average. And it's, in some cases, I think it gives us some clear indication over long-term trends. And so in terms of fatalities, when you average the things out, it seems like a very straight line. And so I don't want to describe it as the norm, because it shouldn't be the norm, and all our efforts are to continue to decrease the number of fatal diving incidents or any incidents as well. But in terms of the better news is that DCI and ascents are showing an overall downward trend. And I think a large part of that is the efforts that all diver training agencies have put into emphasizing the importance of buoyancy control and maintaining that buoyancy control and practicing on a regular basis. And then boating and surfacing, surface incidents show kind of variable trend that is reflected very much by a previous efforts to get boats serviced and all of that kind of thing. Whereas technique, equipment, injury, and miscellaneous incidents seem to follow not quite a straight line, but not a very varied trend at all. Although you increasingly, in comparison to DCI and ascent, boating and surface, that we get substantially smaller numbers of these types of incident because they tend to be less serious, and people perhaps don't see them as a reportable incident, and but they are factors that could be a trigger for one or more of the more serious incidents. So it's worthwhile, if in doubt, report and allow the incident advisors to decide whether or not it's a valid incident or not. So in terms of using the incident report, then the obvious thing is the report itself, and we would encourage you to download a copy from the website, link coming up shortly, and read it, not just the introduction. But this presentation forms part of the use of the incident report, and this session is being recorded and will be put on the BSAC website in the incident report section, so that you can review it and show it within your clubs, so that anybody who didn't make this session can still learn some of the messages from it. But what I would encourage everybody to do is to take the time to read the detailed synopses of incidents. And not just myself, but all previous incidents advisors have encouraged people to read the synopsis in order to learn from other people's mistakes or misfortunes. Mistakes implies that they deliberately made they made a mistake themselves. It may not necessarily be that, but also that really important to recognise that by reporting, people have made a very positive contribution, not just to the publication, but to help our understanding of diving incidents. So I would strongly encourage you to, if you haven't already, to read the synopsis in detail, and there's a lot that can be drawn from that. So some conclusions from the 2020 incident report. COVID restrictions significantly limited the diving, and as a consequence of that, there's a significant reduction in the number of incidents that were reported during 2020. And we believe that there is some clear evidence that incidents were linked to the prevailing restrictions, in the same way that the amount of diving that goes on at any time will be reflective of, will be reflected in a range of incidents. And only January and February were realistically unaffected because of COVID, because it wasn't actually prevalent at that point. And as I've already said, number of incidents linked to the amount of diving taking place. And finally, that sadly, there were still 6 diving fatalities, 6 of our colleagues that unfortunately we've lost. And so learning what we can from their misfortune in particular is really important. And so finally, I've pointed this out in the past in a number of safety talks, but we have reiterated since, at least since 1972, which is the first one, which says virtually the same things, that incidents, a number of incidents in the report could possibly have been avoided if divers had followed some basic principles of safe diving practices. That's been reiterated for over 50 years now and will be for the foreseeable future. But in addition to that, and we identified this a couple of years ago, where we reviewed the efficacy of rescue skills, is that there could have been a lot more serious incidents if it hadn't been for the intervention of other people exercising their trained rescue skills and the support from the rescue services. So thanks to everybody that contributed to that, from helping your body through to the RLI, ambulance service, hospitals, recompression chambers and everything. But if you have had an incident, any abnormal circumstance outside of diving or during diving activities, then please report it, use the online form, and we'll obviously analyse that and produce the 2021 report, which will reflect probably COVID-19 impact in slightly different way, but it's still ongoing, but is likely to pick up on the impact or otherwise of the efforts that BSAC and other agencies put into reminding people about returning to safe diving after a significant break, either enforced or otherwise. Thank you very much for your attention, and safe diving.